Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula with Adam and Rob, and we're gearing up for the second leg of this first half triple header. Rob, it felt weird having no live show last week. It was like something was missing.
Yeah, it definitely was something that doesn't happen all that often for us, but unfortunately, just personal commitments got in the way last week. I'm really looking forward to getting back on to it with the Austria Grand Prix, and it's a sprint race weekend, so a lot more to dissect and discuss.
This is the first of many reminders to all of you that the lineups lock at the start of the sprint race, so keep an eye on that. Make sure you don't miss the lineup lock deadline. We've got a very busy show tonight, and I think you're going to see a common theme of the split between two of the most popular lineup choices heading into the third sprint race of the season. There are some headlines that are attached to each of them, and we'll show you some flavors of each of those lineup options at the end of the show tonight. Rob, let's dive into our winners and losers from Spain. And I don't like to repeat winners, but I got to talk about my man Lewis again. Lewis got his first podium of 2024, which was big news for us Lewis fans. He had 29 fantasy points, which is good enough for third on the grid. And he had stretches like this last year, but he was over $2.5 million more expensive, so he wasn't nearly as valuable as he is now. And we're going to talk a bit about Mercedes later in the show, but there's a lot to love about Lewis in this stretch.
Yeah, Mercedes have really come forward in the last few races as a force to be reckoned with in F1 Fantasy. So Lewis, definitely the leading light on the Silver Arrows team. I think it's exciting to see him back in the winner's circle. It was a slow start for both him and George earlier in the season. So it's looking like they've turned a corner, and it's always great when Mercedes are relevant in F1 Fantasy because it's just one extra team to add to the mix and makes our decisions all the more interesting.
Absolutely. Who was your first winner?
I had Daniel Ricciardo, which to many of you probably, you look at Daniel Ricciardo's result in the Grand Prix and you're like, why is Ricciardo a winner? But I think if we're looking at him in the context of all C-tier assets under 15 million, Ricciardo's had a $0.5 million increase, one of only two C-tier assets, Gasly the other, that came away with that. And he's on a streak of, two races in a row where compared to many other backmarker or midfield drivers, seems to be on the up. So I think a great result for Ricciardo in terms of F1 Fantasy at the very least. And we're going into a sprint race where he had a good result in Miami there in the sprint race itself. So I do think that's a little bit of momentum he can carry over, even if the RB probably looks a little bit off the pace compared to what we're used to. Maybe that's just circuit dependent. So I'm fully expecting Ricciardo and Tsunoda are on for another good performance in Austria.
And I like some of the sound coming out of the RB garage last week. They brought a lot of upgrades into Spain, and they just threw all the spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. They knew their pace was going to be a little bit behind last week, but if they take a week or two to get it right, I think they could really unleash some top 10 potential. And we saw this around Singapore last year. It was AlphaTauri at the time. They had built up some upgrades, and then when they really unleashed, you had Yuki and Daniel contending for top 10 finishes week in and week out. So those are great value picks. I'm keeping a very close eye on both of them.
Well said, Adam. Who's your second winner for Spain?
It's Lando Norris, and it was another huge week for Lando. 51 points after starting on pole, finishing P2. He snagged the fastest lap and driver of the day, or as I like to call it these days, the Lando Norris Participation Trophy. And if Lewis's first podium and Max's dominance in a slower car aren't enough to win this thing, I don't know what is anymore. But I digress. He has the highest points per million value of any driver on the grid, and in recent years, that usually correlates with a must-have driver. So Lando is firmly a Tier A driver in price and in terms of what we want on our fantasy teams.
Yeah, definitely. I think he's made the case as the best 2X driver on non-sprint weekends. Leclerc probably had that up until Monaco. In the last couple of weekends, he's fallen off. I think most interestingly, the pressure's on Max as an F1 fantasy asset to deliver in Austria because Lando's outscored in the last 4 races in a row. So if it's not clear to me now that Lando's must own, he's certainly on the precipice of that right now in F1 fantasy.
Absolutely. And speaking of good news from the Mercedes garage, tell me about your second winner.
Yeah, it was George Russell. He had back-to-back 27-point performances in Canada and most recently in Spain. Another good result and propped up that Mercedes constructor as well between him and Lewis. I think George's 7th race in a row with double-digit points makes me think that Mercedes do have a few more podiums coming forward after he banked one in Canada and now Lewis had one in Spain. I think as well that Ferrari, who's their biggest rival, I would say right now, probably haven't been able to capitalize on some opportunities in the last couple of races. Makes me think that George Russell becomes a leading candidate at that $21 million price. Ahead of the likes of Piastri and Sainz, for me, is probably that best option. So if you're not able to stretch to, a driver like Lewis Hamilton and Leclerc, for example, I really like George Russell as an alternate. So a great result for him, very much in the points. And look, I think he looked like he was on for a podium once or twice over Spain. I think he's got, again, much like Lewis, momentum to carry into Austria too.
That full scent he had on the first turn, I was off the couch when I saw it. Really, really incredible move by George. And what a long way he's come. Think about earlier in the season, Sainz coming back from that appendix surgery, winning that race, and now we're picking George Russell over him. And George is still only run on 10% of teams, so he's a real sleeper pick for those of you that don't have him so far. Heading over to my losers, my first loser was Ferrari, and I got stuck with Ferrari again. Just 44 points for them this week. They were the P4 constructor in another disappointing weekend. They've been outscored by McLaren and Mercedes in 3 of their last 4 races, so they're clearly in a slide. And there is some of that infighting you saw in some of the post-race interviews that Fred Vasseur is going to have to settle after those 2 cars touched on an overtake. So some real negative momentum for Ferrari heading into the sprint this weekend.
Yeah, definitely. It also seems as though there's been no meaningful updates for their car since Imola. So I wonder if the last 2-3 races where Mercedes, McLaren, even Red Bull have brought differing upgrades. Ferrari, I think, have brought a few different things here and there, but nothing to really enhance the performance of that car. So as you said, they've definitely been clinically outperformed. And, over the course of the last 2 weeks, they're totaling 28 points, which is no doubt a product of not just DNFs, but overall deteriorating performance. So probably one to monitor. And given that they are more than Mercedes, you have to think they're probably on the chopping block in several teams this week.
So, Rob, the McLaren team's been mostly good news for these last few weeks, but you have one McLaren asset on your losers list. Tell us about Oscar.
Yeah, Oscar, he finished the weekend with 15 points. I think loser in a sense that even though he did go up in price, was the lowest scoring B tier or higher driver. So it isn't a great sign for him when the likes of Sainz, Russell, as I pointed out before, who are priced pretty similar to him, are outscoring him. I do think it was a one-off weekend for Oscar Piastri, just because we saw, a few races back between Miami and Monaco, some really strong performances. And I do think it's a matter of time until he can turn it around. Austria, I think, is a great opportunity for him to demonstrate that. But when you look at, those around him kind of in the upper half of the grid, just not enough production from him. So I think McLaren have got the tools in that car to challenge for a podium, as Lando's demonstrated. But we need to see that from Oscar too, to make him a viable asset in F1 fantasy. I can see here another asset, another driver that's probably been very much in the middle of the grid this season. Tell me about Fernando Alonso.
Tough week for the Spanish drivers. So for Alonso, just 1 fantasy point. He was tied with Sargent and Bottas for last. Over the last 5 races, he's been outscored by the likes of Pierre Gasly and Zhou Guanyu. So just absolutely not delivering for the value that we were hoping for. In that same stretch, he's lost 0.1 million in value. And on the season, Rob, he's the 19th driver in value gained. Only Sargent is lower. So this year, Fernando Alonso just hasn't been that asset we've been relying on for cost cap gains and for points. Last year, he was the savior for a lot of our teams in the first half of the season. So really a tale of 2 seasons. His opening price this year really cost corrected for some of that gain we saw last year.
Yeah, it's very much an average season, to say the least, for the Aston Martins. And Fernando, who we've seen in the past with Alpine, for example, really outperformed the car, just hasn't been able to do that this year in the Aston Martin. But I also think that's partly a product of the fact that the top 4 teams are a cut above the rest. So it may just not be a great season for Fernando. I'm really hoping he can deliver a couple of good results this season, but it seems like mostly a write-off and a bigger void in F1 fantasy for the time being too.
And so the theme of my 2 losers, Ferrari, Spanish driver, you just bring them both together with Carlos Sainz. So tell me about his weekend.
Yeah, Sainz had below average performance by his standards. He had 16 points, good for 6th on the grid. We saw, as you mentioned before, a lot of kind of on-track fighting between him and Charles. As you said, there were a few words shared by both of them after to the media. It just looks as though after his good results earlier in the season, Australia the standout, there's just been a downward trajectory since about China, Miami. He's net zero points over the last 2 weekends, not helped by that DNF in Canada. But the fact that he's not only outperformed by his teammate, but the likes of the Mercedes drivers, which are priced pretty much identically to him, makes him such an expendable asset in the fantasy game right now. So not a great result for Carlos. I think many of us who owned him have already moved away from him. I think you moved into or moved away from him more recently than I did. I had him for a couple of weeks back in Imola, but I do think it's probably time for him to leave your teams if you've got him still at this point.
The frustrating thing running Ferrari assets last week was that they looked good in free practice. The sims, which we thought would be more predictive than they ever have been before, suggested that Ferrari were going to be the P2 team right behind Red Bull, only for them to come out in the middle of the pack for qualifying in P5, P6. And then for them to come out after that and say they were confused about the pace, they're not sure why they were slow. It was a harbinger of things to come for the race, and they never quite got out of their own way for it. So definitely, like we mentioned earlier, some negative momentum for Ferrari.
Yeah, I think most fascinatingly, the last couple of race weekends has shown that the race and qualifying sims on F1 that are published after FP2 have been somewhat misleading. And I feel as though even though single lap pace isn't the most indicative for performance over a race distance, it seems to be more or less the source of truth based on the last couple of races. Mercedes in particular have looked very good in free practice, whereas Ferrari have kind of, for the most part, been around P3 to P7. So it's I think it's very telling as to kind of what that means for making decisions moving forward.
And we're going to get some of the best information of all this weekend because we get to see sprint qualifying and see how some of these drivers line up. So hopefully we'll have a little bit more information heading into this weekend. Let's head now into our contest question. And if you head over to our FanAmp base, enter a chance to win a great prize from our sponsor, Fifth Gear Garms. Who is the better 2X DRS boost option this week, Lando or Max? So we're going to be covering every angle of this on our hit list. But Rob, do you have any initial stabs you want to take at this?
Yeah, I think it's certainly been made more difficult by Lando's recent result in Spain. Heading into Austria, I was like 99.9% locked on Max Verstappen, and I still think for me he has the edge because of his history there, because of his typically very good results in sprint race weekends. So I think because it's a sprint race weekend, Max for me, I believe will outscore Lando. But I think if we're looking at it on non-sprint weekends, it's an entirely different discussion. But for me, for Austria, I'm on Max as of right now. What about you, Adam?
It's so close. I'm leaning toward Max as well, but I think you're about to bring up a really good point later on in the hit list, is that Lando is really good and he allows you to afford slightly better drivers on the rest of your team. And does that do enough to just tip the scales in favor of Lando? So we'll definitely evolve into that as the show goes on. And before we move on, I just wanted to give a shout out to BZ05. We didn't have a live show last week, but you won last week's prize. So congratulations to you, BZ. All right, Rob, without further ado, let's move into our hit list for this week, starting with one of my favorite topics, the sudden rise of the Mercedes constructor. You can see here 6 straight races of 40 or more fantasy points, 3 races this season of at least 60 points, and not even McLaren have that many 60-point performances, so Mercedes have really been on a tear lately.
Yeah, I think consistency is the name of the game in F1 fantasy, and they've been exactly that since Australia. As you pointed out, a great record of 60-plus point performances, and I think they've probably been overshadowed at different points in the season by the other teams that have emerged as alternative F1 fantasy assets. But I think the last couple of races has truly demonstrated their performance, and I definitely think it's made Lewis and George more appealing F1 fantasy assets. Lewis had back-to-back $1 million fantasy increases across Monaco and Canada, another good increase of 0.3 million in Spain. So he's on the upward trajectory. And I think because of the fact that Ferrari has coincided with a drop-off in form, Mercedes have really snatched that opportunity and emerged as, in my opinion, if I had to rank them, probably the second best constructor at the moment.
Makes a lot of sense. And you had mentioned the cost cap gains being part of the fuel to why you think Mercedes are a top 2 constructor right now. Mercedes as a constructor has increased 2 million over the last 5 races, which is great value for a tier B asset. Then over the last 4 races, no driver has increased their value more than Lewis at 2.6 million. So these guys are really delivering for you. Lewis has the second highest points per million over that same 4 race stretch. So it's been a really great time to invest in Mercedes. And this is a trend throughout the whole season. If you can jump in on some of these trending assets right away, you'll get cost cap gains, additional points, and this can make or break your whole season.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to slicing up some of the different team combinations that involve Mercedes later in the show, because I do think their viability over the last few races has certainly shone through. So looking forward to discussing that in more detail, and whether or not running them in all lineups just because of their affordable price point makes it a viable option.
Absolutely. Now, moving from one world champion to another, let's talk about Max Verstappen, because a headline that went under the radar last week was that Max took his final MGUK, MGUH, internal combustion engine, and turbocharger. So if he takes any of these 4 engine parts over the next 14 races, he's going to get a penalty. And so I doubt it's going to come this weekend, but I think we got to keep an eye out, because that max penalty will be lurking probably in the next month or so.
Yeah, definitely. It has been some time since we saw Max take a quite far back penalty on the grid, and when that does happen every blue moon or so, he jumps at the front of the queue as a must-own F1 asset for that weekend. So I'm really liking the opportunity that presents when that comes up. You and I have both speculated that it could well be Belgium because of that high overtake nature of that track, and I do think that we've seen Lando Norris score driver of the days from losing pole position. It's going to take, everything for Max to win a driver of the day award, but the most likely occurrence that would be when he takes, as you say, a grid penalty. So if we see 5, 10 plus grid penalties for Max in a single race weekend, I do think that extra 10 points is his to lose.
When we look back to the last 3 times Max took an engine penalty, it was Belgium 2022, Monza 2022, and Belgium 2023. He won all 3 of those races, and both of those Belgium races set season high fantasy totals. And in that 2022 race, 13 positions gained, driver of the day, fastest lap in P1. He scored 75 points on that day, and no one has topped that score since. So it looks like Max likes to take his engine penalties at this circuit, like you said, Rob. So that race is coming up the last weekend of July. So mark your calendars, because it might be a great time to get Max on your team.
Yeah, I'm really very much earmarking that. It will become a bit of a interesting decision if we go for him for Austria, then move off for a couple of races and bring him back in. So a lot of forward planning involved, but I do like Max for Belgium. As you pointed out, a great record there.
And over the last 2 segments of the hit list, Rob, we've been talking about the merits of bringing Max onto your team. And one way to afford him really easily with Lando Norris is by using the limitless chip. And on this show, I've been outspoken about the virtues of limitless on a sprint weekend and highlighting how you'll tend to score more points on a sprint weekend than a regular race. But there's been some debate about this. Which weekend is the best time to use it? So far, just looking at these last few races, Limitless has edged out all of the others, China obviously being far and away the highest scoring race of the season, but only 3 of the 8 non-sprint races outside of that beat Miami. So still a good shout to use this chip. And if you were to correctly get the right team in Bahrain or last week in Spain, you would have needed to have George Russell, the least owned asset in the game, on your team in those lineups. So really unlikely you would pick the right team on a non-sprint weekend and beat these 2 races.
Yeah, I think there's been quite a number of school of thoughts, most recently, given that this race is the last sprint weekend until we get to Circuit of the Americas in October. And I think most recently, because of Mercedes improving, Ferrari being a bit hit and miss lately, and even Red Bull constructor not really delivering as a result of Checo's inconsistency, it does muddy the waters a little bit for those limitless lineups, and the variation in the spread of points is going to be wider than it has certainly been in the last kind of 10 races or so. So it is a tricky one. I do think that the longer you leave it, the harder it is to have that point of differentiation, because as the season goes on, we'll be able to afford more lineups with more expensive drivers. But I do think as well, the fact that there is so much variation in teams at the moment suggests it's by no means an easy decision to use limitless at Austria.
It's going to be very interesting to see who ends up using it. Do people still have it left? I know so many people in our community used it either at China or with us in Miami. So whoever has it left, do let us know. Did you plan on using it or not? Maybe we'll have a poll on the live show to see who still has it left and who's mulling it over. And so looking ahead to this weekend, we're going back to the Red Bull Ring, and there's a lot we want to unpack about this track and its history. It's got high overtakes thanks to its 3 DRS zones, and this is traditionally a track that posts the top 5 or 6 overtake numbers on the season, so that's good news. And this is another low retirement race. Now, if you're looking back at the history, just stroll right past 2020 because it was a bit of an aberration. It was the season opener of the COVID-shortened 2022. There were 9 retirements in that race, but there were almost all reliability issues. So I'd say overall, this is a low retirement race. And Rob, you have a great point about how a low DNF track could impact price changes. Could you share that with us?
Yeah, it was something that probably emerged to me most recently in Spain than any other circuit we've seen so far this year. But as we've seen most recently at Barcelona, we had no DNFs, and as a result, as you'd expect, all of the best drivers in the best cars scored the highest. And as we've established with the price change algorithm and how that can affect the normalized points, that ultimately dictates what price a driver will change after that race weekend. All of those midfield and back market drivers that had scores between 6 and 1 point, sometimes 6 points is enough for a $0.5 million increase. But because there were no DNFs to bring down the average for that weekend, only Gasly and Ricciardo, who exceeded 6.5 points, which was 0.5 of the average for the weekend, went up in price. Everyone else went down in price. That was a C-tier asset. So you're not going to see as many DNFs at a track like Spain, at a track like Austria, because of the fact that they are slightly easier to navigate compared to some of the more tricky ones. And I think, as you pointed out, with the not with the overtakes, with the retirements, there probably aren't going to be too many in Austria. So does that open the door for running a couple of B-tier drivers as opposed to 1 A-tier driver and 4 C-tier drivers?
So that's one being on the scale for Lando Norris and a good B-tier asset versus Max and probably the 4 cheapest drivers you can find. It'd be very interesting to see how we have that balance. You could also just go all in on the points, take Max and the constructors' points, and then hope your 4 back markers survive, and then let the money situation float into another week because it's a sprint weekend. There's so much going into this decision this week. It seems like every week we've had big decisions to make.
Yeah, it has been really, really interesting to navigate. I'd say since China, it's been a round of different decisions every passing week with those back-to-back sprints, and then McLaren on the radar, then now Mercedes. So there seems to be a huge shift in the lineups every couple of weeks, and I can't, up until recently, remember the last time I had 3 free transfers heading into a weekend. So it's nice to have a little bit more flexibility coming into Austria.
Speaking of difficult decisions, let's talk about the fan and pick of the week question. Which former Red Bull driver finishes the highest? Albon, Ricciardo, or Gasly? Rob, I'll let you go first.
I know we were talking about Ricciardo earlier, and I think that performance from him and Tsunoda was a one-off. And then Alpine are looking much better the last few weeks. Gasly has had points, not fantasy points, just normal F1 driver championship points in all of his last 3 races. So it is an encouraging sign for him. It seems as though Alpine are on top of the car a little bit more and have shed a bit of that excess weight they were carrying through the first 3 or 4 races of the year. So it's a tough one. I do think the momentum is with the Alpine driver just slightly. So for me, Gasly is going to be my pick that finishes higher across the weekend between those 3. What about you?
He's my pick too. He also has a great history at this circuit. He has 4 straight points finishes at the Red Bull Ring. So give me the gas, man.
Love to see it.
Last but not least for the hit list tonight, we're going to do a little spring cleaning. So once we heard Lando Norris graduated to price tier A, we thought he'd be all done growing his price, and then we'd have to lean on those tier B assets with Ferrari and Mercedes to grow our cost cap the most. But you can see here, over these last 4 races, he's gone up 1.6 million compared to tier B drivers and Leclerc and Sainz, who are both under $1 million. So Rob, what does that leave us with for this week? And if we want to build our cost caps, who should we lean into?
I do think it is, if you're looking at trying to build budget a little bit, which may have taken a back seat lately, It has to be Mercedes at the moment. I think they are the most consistently performing B tier asset, both the drivers and the constructors, compared to the other three teams on screen. And I'm really liking the momentum they're carrying, certainly since Canada, into a race like Austria. So I do think they're probably my pick of the bunch. And as you can see here, all three Mercedes assets have increased by 1.9 million or more, most recently in the last 4 races. So it is a really good sign for them there. And then the McLaren assets, building on that same momentum. Lando Norris in particular, an A-tier asset, still going up 1.6 million. Pretty impressive consistency.
Yeah, it's fantastic. And if you've been running Norris and Hamilton during this stretch, if you invested in them at the beginning of this streak versus the Ferrari duo, you'd have 2.4 million more, plus a ton of points because Ferrari had that debacle in Canada. And this is the benefit of staying with the game all season long versus just having a zombie team and letting the points play out. As these shifts come into play, we can adjust, bank the extra points, grow our cost caps, and then just slowly work our way up higher and higher in the rankings. So this slide's really important for us as we try to move forward.
Yeah, definitely. What's your take on Ferrari as an asset, constructor and driver alike, the next few race weekends? Because they have been up until recently the best value team going around F1 Fantasy, and it seems as though that they're slowly falling out of favour. Certainly Leclerc and Sainz with the emergence of McLaren and Mercedes.
I think for me, particularly because I'm playing a little emotional after these last 2 weeks, I rolled with them and they burnt me 2 weeks in a row. I think I'm going to have to move away from them this week. Let them just show me that they've got something left in the tank, that they're turning the corner before I go back into them. So I'd say they're a no-go for me in Australia, but I'm open to looking at them again come Silverstone in 2 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, in a similar camp, it's certainly decision time. And I think with McLaren, good form, recently strong performances, it's hard to overlook the McLaren constructor right now.
So Rob, let's get into some of that lineup build. Maybe you can walk us through a few of these options as we start setting what our teams look like at different value tiers for this week. So the first one we had talked about was 112 million. Can you show us some possible lineup options for that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think we start with, as we usually do, the constructors and probably add 2x driver. And I think you could go a couple of different ways, but to avoid any debate around Verstappen versus Norris for Austria, let's start with some of the better value constructors at a lower price point. I think for us, Mercedes is the obvious pick there. The other one, you'd probably have to go for Ferrari if you're kind of at that $112 million price bracket, unless of course you're taking a haircut on your 2x. What do you think about that?
Despite what I just said about Ferrari, if your budget is down at 112, I think this is a good look for you because that allows you to then play Verstappen as your 2x driver. He'll anchor your points, even if Ferrari has a tough week. And then you can play no Bottas and no Sargent on the rest of your drivers and still be okay. I think with this look, we could do double Alpine, Hulkenberg, Zhou, which could be some of those safer tier C assets.
Yeah, definitely. I think you've got, reliability in Hulkenberg. He'll always be a good qualifier. The improved performance of Alpine, as you pointed out. And then Zhou, who typically qualifies at the very back or close to. So at least you've got the upside of gaining positions as opposed to having to fight for a few overtakes in the midfield.
And you could, in place of Max, you could have Lando there and then use that extra 4.8 million to just upgrade one of those other midfield drivers. You could start getting into the tier B assets by adding it to say a Gasly or Ocon.
Yeah, exactly. Interesting.
So then if we move down into the 117, now you can start doing upgraded versions of some of these teams. And the first flavor, I'll offer a Max flavor first here, is if we have Red Bull, Ferrari, and Max. Now you're double dipping in Red Bull. You've got they got another 15 points in fastest pit stop. So as long as Checo's finishing the race, and it's a bonus if he makes it into Q3, so you get the teammate points. Verstappen and Red Bull are going to really feast for you in this. And then again, finishing your team with basically non-Sargent midfield drivers.
Yeah, definitely agree. Let's throw in again. I think we were going to go for Alpine for some consistency.
Yeah, I've got.
Oh, maybe that's a bit too much. Get Ocon out.
Yeah, I think we have to do double Sauber here with Gasly and Hulkenberg.
And that would just squeeze in, wouldn't it? Yeah. I think the interesting thing in the case for Red Bull is, you pointed out how good they are with pit stops alone, and Perez, we showed that he could at least squeeze into the top 8 for points on the weekend, and 82 points was their best result since the sprint in Miami. And if you look at their streak across Japan, China, and Miami, they've had some scores north of 85 points. So I fully expect that Red Bull are probably on for another big result in Austria. And if Checo can get to the end, I think the pit stop points will certainly boost their potential.
And so I suspect that'll be one of the flavors we look at moving off of Verstappen, is if you move Lando in, you can then keep that Red Bull constructor to hedge in case Max wins the race. You'll still get a bunch of points out of that. Then you could redistribute the 4.8 million among some of these drivers. You could get Gasly up into a Lance Stroll, or you can potentially drop Ferrari down to Mercedes, get a little extra cash, and then spread that amongst those midfield drivers. I think that's going to be a popular pick this week. Norris hedged with Red Bull. Yeah,
100% agree. I think as well, if you're game enough to go without Red Bull, that opens the door for another B tier driver in say the Gasly slot, as opposed to Gasly himself. So let's say I think this is probably a slightly higher risk approach here, going without any Red Bull at a circuit like Austria, but who would we slot? We'd have 21 million, so I think that's
Carlos Sainz territory, I think.
That's Sainz, Piastri, just about anything below Sainz, for argument's sake. So there's some really good candidates there, but running no Red Bull at the Red Bull Ring does kind of spell a little bit of.
It's definitely tricky. I'd say if you run a lineup like this, you might want to consider an autopilot or something that would hedge you in case disaster befalls one of your two top assets there.
And then let's say for a team of 122 million, if we're running the bones of this team we've got on screen currently, where do you think with an extra 5 million we could make a couple of upgrades or changes?
Here's what's crazy. You could, with an extra 5 million, you can turn Lando into Max and run Max and Sainz, and all of a sudden this team gets a whole lot safer. And you can keep Sainz, Piastri, whoever tickles your fancy on that last spot. Rob can't afford, or neither can I, 122 million. But picture Sainz or Piastri in that last spot.
Yep.
And then the flip side of that, like we had modeled out earlier, you can do Norris, Sainz, Red Bull, Ferrari, and then 3 bottom drivers, a Sargent, Joe, Hulkenberg kind of thing. So you just keep your fingers and toes crossed on those bottom 3 drivers, and then just hope for a ton out of Lando, Carlos, and the constructors.
So yeah, you'd have Ferrari in that second slot, wouldn't you?
Or potentially Mercedes, whoever's looking good coming out of sprint quali. I'm happy either way.
Yeah, a couple extra million you can squeeze in Sargent. So yeah, that's a really strong lineup, isn't it? But you have to hope that Ferrari have their act together, because it just hasn't really looked like that lately.
No, absolutely. And I'd be happy to have Mercedes in that same spot. And this is really the beauty of having such a big money budget. The reason why we start leaning into cost cap as much as we can, as long as we're not sacrificing points too much, because you can really get an advantage over the rest of the field.
Definitely.
Speaking of the field, Rob, let's look at the Fantasy Formula League leaderboard. We have a new leader this week, Leapers 1, who had a nearly perfect lineup. They had Lando, Lewis, McLaren, Mercedes, and just all the right midfield drivers. So I'm sure their cost cap went up a ton after last week. And as far as the top scorers from Spain, they almost all used limitless, which, as we saw earlier, topped out at 362 points. So congratulations to all of you that cleaned up in Spain.
We're almost halfway through the season, so I think we're going to see a few more positions on the leaderboard normalize. I know there's probably still a couple of you that haven't used any of the powerful chips, so if you have got limitless still ready to go, maybe now's a good time to make up some ground. But I think about a month or two ago, you and I, Adam, were saying this will probably be about the time that the leaderboard kind of takes some shape, and I think it's a great sign for Andrew at the top, Radek and Jesse, that they're setting the pace for us, and we're the ones that have to make up some ground.
We're up for the challenge, Rob, for sure. And as we look ahead to this weekend, I took an early look at the weather, and I see rain Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So Let's see if we can get a little chaos at the Red Bull Ring, make it difficult for the Red Bull constructor.
Definitely.
So, Rob, we haven't locked in an exact day and time yet, but we are committed. We're doing a live show this week, so keep an eye out on all of our socials. We'll announce that day and time so that we can join all of you in preparation for the Austrian Grand Prix this weekend. Thank you all so much for watching, and we'll see you at the live show.